Waking up in the ICU, the wife heard her husband's conversation on the phone. And upon learning about the will, she pretended to be dead. Consciousness was returning to Leslie Dean slowly, as if reluctantly. At first, it seemed she was simply asleep, dreaming a wonderful dream full of vibrant colors, like the palette of a talented artist. Yellow circles alternated with white triangles and blue squares, forming the most intricate shapes, like a magical kaleidoscope. Sometimes Leslie felt as if she was floating in the air, weightless like a feather, and other times it felt entirely different, creating the illusion of heaviness throughout her body. Leslie didn't know how much time she had spent in this borderline state, where everything was so ghostly and unclear that it was impossible to tell if she was alive or not. Unable to open her eyes, Leslie heard a strange beep. At first, it seemed distant and barely discernible, then it grew louder and acquired a tonality, reminding her of an alien ship responding to a digital beacon. Her consciousness slowly shifted from the darkness of oblivion to the light of awakening. At that moment, Leslie realized she was likely in a hospital room, otherwise, how could she explain the persistent smell of disinfectant and medications, and similar odors? But why couldn't she open her eyes? Was it really that difficult? The sounds of monitors and medical equipment became more distinct, blending harmoniously with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Gathering her remaining strength, Leslie finally emerged from her borderline state, and her first tactile sensation was the heaviness of her body, connected to a world of wires, various strips, and drains. The blinding white light overhead pressed on her eyes, causing a panic attack. Why did they even turn it on? And there was also some strange round blue eye in the corner, blinking as if counting the moments of her life. Leslie couldn't figure out what it was at first. How could she, with her vision still blurry and unclear? Maybe this eye was just a figment of her imagination. Who would know? The sound of a door opening made Leslie flinch. Not in the usual sense, of course, but in a way that was invisible to the eye. Right after the door closed, a voice she knew so well, so dear to her, made her heart beat faster. "So, how's our Leslie? Still in a coma?" "It's been almost 2 weeks now." Since the speaker was her husband, Leslie tried to listen to every word. She also realized that Alfred Dean wasn't alone in the room, and he was probably talking to a doctor or someone from the medical staff. "Well, Alfred, you understand perfectly well that the delivery was complicated, triplets, a C-section, and your wife's health wasn't exactly perfect. Shortly before the delivery, we conducted an extensive examination, and the results were unsatisfactory even at that stage," the doctor replied. Leslie's heart beat faster. A C-section? Of course, she had been pregnant. Oh God, how could she forget that? All these medications. But where were the children? What happened to them? She had so many questions that her mind clouded again. What if something was wrong with her babies? Multiple pregnancies are a huge responsibility and strain. Leslie didn't hear the end of her husband and the doctor's conversation because her senses failed her again, preventing her from even signaling that she was alive. The young mother couldn't understand why her awakening from the coma went unnoticed. Why didn't the sensors work? Where was all this praised automation and various regulators? Meanwhile, Alfred didn't leave the room, staying alone with his wife. Leslie couldn't fully open her eyes as she was still too weak to do so. "Well, lying down, Leslie?" "Go ahead, rest, no need to hurry," Alfred said with a strange intonation. What is he talking about? And why in such a tone? Leslie thought. Of course, Alfred had no idea that his wife had come to, so he spoke frankly and said everything he thought. Since the pause dragged on a bit, Leslie tried to glance over to see what was happening. But at that moment, the silence of the hospital room was interrupted by the loud trill of a cell phone resting in the side pocket of Alfred's pants. Through her partially closed eyes, Leslie saw that her husband was wearing a characteristic hospital gown and protective shoe covers. Underneath the gown, a yellow shirt peeked out, contrasting with the pristine white walls of the room. The bright color lifted Leslie's spirits a bit, reminding her of the ripe lemon she had been growing in a pot on the windowsill before the birth. However, Leslie didn't like the ringtone that played from the phone speakers. She didn't have time to fully assess it, as Alfred immediately took the call. "Hello, Samantha? Is that you?" "Yes, glad to hear you. And I love you." "Where?" "In the hospital, where else?" "Yes, in the ICU. What could there be to do here, lying like a vegetable with no telling when she'll come out of the coma? It's only to my advantage, you understand." "The kids, what about them?" "Well, they'll go to the orphanage, that's where they belong." Leslie's heart almost jumped out of her chest in indignation. God, what is he talking about? Is this a dream, another vision? Meanwhile, her husband continued to coo with the mysterious girl, whose name meant nothing to Leslie. "Samantha, don't rush things, okay? The will is made, now we'll get a notary, a handwriting expert. Well, we'll have to share the inheritance anyway, otherwise, you can't get anywhere without greasing the wheels. I'll forge the signature and then we'll go for our money. And Leslie can continue exploring parallel worlds. We won't turn off the machines just yet. Let her breathe some oxygen for the last time." "Well, okay, I gotta run, Samantha. I still need to get these kids into the orphanage." "Yeah, okay, love you, kiss you." Leslie felt awful after hearing these words. God, how could he? Talking about her death right in her presence. And the children? What did they have to do with it? It's just unthinkable to give the kids to the orphanage. Where's the conscience, after all? Alfred stood a little longer, then came close to Leslie and, taking out his phone, photographed her with the flash. She didn't know why he did this. In general, seeing her husband's manipulations out of the corner of her eye, Leslie closed her eyes, pretending to be dead. Let him think he has won. Let him enjoy the moment of triumph and use what belongs to others. But I will survive, no matter what. I'll fight back, and then I'll hold my children to my chest, Leslie mentally repeated to herself like a mantra. She could almost feel her husband's intense gaze, who was still standing at arm's length, savoring the sight. A sardonic smirk froze on Alfred's lips, which said a lot. Finally, having satisfied his curiosity, he left the room, shuffling his feet like an old man. From the monstrous tension of the shock she experienced, sweat broke out on Leslie's forehead, and she was terribly thirsty, as only someone stranded in a vast desert could be. Her parched tongue scratched against her palate as Leslie tried to give some sign. After all, in movies, it always shows that when a person comes out of a coma, everything around them starts beeping and shining with all the colors of the rainbow from red to yellow and green. At that moment, the door of the ward opened again, and someone's cautious, slightly hesitant steps were heard. Probably a nurse. If it were a doctor, he would enter confidently and unhurriedly, Leslie thought. Meanwhile, the footsteps came closer. She cautiously opened her eyes and saw she was wrong. A young doctor, looking somewhat embarrassed, stood before her. Frequently checking the notes in his notepad, the doctor began to carefully inspect the connected equipment, checking the integrity of the connections and the overall operation of the devices. For a moment, Leslie even thought that Alfred had specifically sent this stranger in a doctor's coat to hasten the moment of obtaining the long-awaited inheritance from the will. And yet Leslie had left no will. Why would she? She had no plans of leaving this life. It was all her husband's doing. The smart guy, composing everything himself. Forging the signature and bribing the notary with a hefty sum. No, that won't happen. While Leslie was waiting for some trick from the stranger in the doctor's coat, he did nothing bad, only checking the old medical equipment, replacing which had now become a matter of honor for the patient. Indeed, Leslie could afford it, as she was known as the Sea Queen. Fishing fleets roamed the entire area, floating fish processing plants worked properly, and there was also the tourism business, with a couple of hotels on the coast that provided a stable income. Well, there we go, I knew it, another malfunction. I'll have to notify the chief, the doctor said to himself and carefully checked some switch. At that very moment, the room was filled with strange sounds, signaling to the medical staff that the patient had woken up. The doctor jumped in surprise and stepped back. Oh, what is this? Did I do something wrong? Leslie, mustering her courage, opened her eyes and immediately met the doctor's gaze. He smiled and was about to say something when the door burst open and a panting resuscitator rushed in. Edward, you're acting on your own again? Look what you've done. The equipment's gone haywire. Why did I ever agree to take you as an intern? I can't stand the sight of you. Where do your hands grow from? Edward, visibly embarrassed, glanced furtively at Leslie. I didn't do anything special, William. I just entered the room and checked the equipment. The chief, taking a flashlight, bent over Leslie to check her reaction to light. He remarked, "And do you understand anything about this, Edward? Why on earth did you mess with the equipment? Though you got lucky, it seems you meddled just in time. Our patient has woken up. How are you feeling, Leslie?" She forced a smile at the corners of her lips, but she didn't have the strength for more. However, William Dixon was quite satisfied with this. At that moment, people with various medical instruments began to bustle around the patient, measuring, recording, consulting with the chief. Leslie simply enjoyed the feeling of calm and returning to her familiar world. Meanwhile, the hero of the day, the intern, stood modestly in the corner, curiously watching the patient. Leslie desperately tried to convey all that she felt in this awkward moment through her gaze. For if it weren't for Edward, who noticed a malfunction in one of the sensors, Leslie's awakening might not have been noticed for a long time. It turned out later that the future resuscitator's name was Edward Murphy. Judging by how the chief treated him, he was an outcast in the department. Leslie knew what that was like, having experienced something similar in school. She didn't want to recall it now. "Water, please, give me some water," Leslie croaked, feeling a nagging pain in her lower abdomen along with it. Most likely, it was caused by the body's reaction to the surgical stitches after a cesarean section. "Water? Right away, Leslie, the nurse will bring it, though you can't drink much yet, only cotton soaked in water," William caught himself. Leslie nodded in agreement, then asked the most troubling question. "Doctor, tell me, how are my children? They're all right, aren't they?" The chief smiled in response. "Yes, Leslie, the indicators are excellent, though due to the special situation, we put them on artificial feeding. No allergies or rejections were noticed, so congratulations, you have 2 boys and a girl." At the mention of the babies, Leslie's eyes filled with tears. Oh Lord, how she wished she could hug and hold them now, but she couldn't, at least not yet, maybe later when she was transferred to a regular ward. "William, I have a request for you. Please promise me you'll fulfill it," Leslie pleaded with the last of her strength. The chief looked at the patient in surprise. "Something else, Leslie? The children, my children, don't give them to anyone, do you hear me? I am their mother, you understand." The resuscitator shook his head. "Oh no, Leslie, who would I give them to? Besides, right now, the babies are in the maternity ward, being taken care of by other specialists. My job is to get you back on your feet as soon as possible. You see, because of your body's peculiarities, you had a bad reaction to the anesthesia and fell into a coma, but I assure you, everything was under control." Having calmed down a bit, Leslie wearily closed her eyes. Now she could relax a little and rest, especially after the nurse gave her an injection and the orderly moistened her lips with a damp cotton swab. Now she no longer doubted that she would recover, and all those visions of colorful geometric shapes would be left in the past. The young businesswoman was also no longer afraid of her husband, who was clearly up to something nasty. "It's okay, we'll deal with it. I just need to pull myself together," Leslie thought as she drifted into sleep. Gradually, her room became empty again. The nurses went about their usual tasks, and the orderlies began cleaning. Edward left the room among the last. He very much wanted to stay a bit longer, to monitor the patient's condition, to talk with her, just like a real doctor. And besides, he really liked Leslie, not in a head-over-heels way, but still. Although, what chances could he have? She was married, with 3 children, practically a mother of many. And who was he? An intern who never gives up? Look, William is very strict with him in the department, driving him to the point of exhaustion. Bring this, fetch that, but after all, he was a future doctor, it wasn't right to treat a colleague this way. However, Edward never got upset about it. He understood that life isn't as simple as one would like it to be, and to achieve something, you need to put in maximum effort. Taking a moment of free time, the intern decided to go out into the yard to get some fresh air. The weather was nice, and the gentle rays of the sun touched his face, revealing a network of barely noticeable freckles. Edward's mood noticeably improved, primarily because he fixed a malfunction in the equipment, which allowed him to notice that Leslie had regained consciousness. At the same time, Edward wasn't sure that the equipment in the room was faulty, he just felt it with some elusive sixth sense, which prompted him to check the connection and operation of the device. Naturally, William didn't attach much importance to this, considering himself the head of the department, guided only by what he was accustomed to over the years of working in resuscitation. Edward didn't like him from the first glance. And it wasn't about the fact that the smart, educated guy had corrected him on the mispronunciation of a word. There was something else, unknown even to Edward. William was quite lenient with other interns, sometimes even giving them breaks, but Edward always got something complicated and difficult to do. Whenever a homeless person was admitted to the ICU, Alexander Hart would certainly send Edward to attend to him. No, this didn't mean that the man in distress received less medical help than the other patients. In this sense, Alexander was meticulous, rich or poor, all the same. So, to Alexander's credit, it must be said that he treated everyone equally. Edward really liked this quality, as he also didn't divide people into rich and poor. He always sympathized with those who were poorer than him and needed a piece of bread, because he himself had gone through a tough school of life, often running away from home where his alcoholic parents staged endless scandals. Edward would run away from home just to find the desired peace and comfort. He loved sitting in the park, listening to the birds singing, or watching the majestic swans swim in the city pond. When he turned 10, his parents were deprived of their parental rights. Then there was an orphanage for a couple of years and a new foster family, in which both the father and mother were medical workers. It was then that Edward realized he wanted to become a doctor, just like his foster parents. Linda and Robert Austin didn't impose any conditions on him, giving their son complete freedom to choose his future. Whether he wanted to study law or become a doctor or builder, they promised him full support, which indeed happened during his university studies. In his group, Edward was one of the best, not because his medical parents helped him at home and gave valuable tips, but because he genuinely wanted to study and become a real doctor. A doctor capable of healing almost any illness and alleviating the suffering of patients. Edward was brought out of his daydreams by the voice of the janitor, Mark Johnson. "Good afternoon, young man, out for some fresh air?" Edward smiled and immediately replied, "Yes, Mark, I came out for a bit, got a free minute and decided to get some fresh air. It's so beneficial. I actually believe that walks in nature can heal many ailments." Mark nodded in agreement. "I support you, Edward. I'm working as a janitor now, and you know what? I've become much healthier than before. In my younger years, I worked in the thermal shop at the factory, and you know what the atmosphere is like there? It really took a toll on my health. But when I retired, the doctors recommended physical work and spending more time outdoors, so I became a janitor." Edward looked at the elderly man with respect. He had liked Mark from the first day they met because of his wisdom, calm demeanor, and his ability to provide a sensible answer to any question. Now, sensing the young man's mood, Mark quietly asked, "So, is William giving you a hard time?" The intern frowned and looked around cautiously. "Do you mean William Dixon?" The janitor smiled. "Yes, him. I remember William being just like you are now. He was also naive and trusting, but he's changed over the years, gained posture, dignity, and learned to speak properly." "Well, you're not entirely right about that. I still correct him sometimes," Edward remarked with a smile, sincerely hoping that the department head wasn't listening in. Mark thought for a moment, then asked, "Listen, Edward, how do you generally feel about animals?" Positively, or would you rather avoid them? The young man raised his eyebrows in surprise. Positively, of course. What do you mean? Right now, I don't have my own place. I'm renting an apartment so as not to bother my parents, so I can't have a pet yet. But I definitely would if I could. Why do you ask? Mark smiled. I found a puppy the other day, small, sitting under a bush. Its mom got hit by a car. She, poor thing, was bringing him a piece of bread from the bakery kiosk over there. She found it across the road and decided to bring it to her baby to treat him, but some reckless driver got her, damn him. Edward shrugged doubtfully. A puppy? Where is it? I don't see it anywhere. Mark put his index finger to his lips with a significant look. Keep it down, he's living in my storage room. I haven't shown him to anyone. If the head sees him, he'll surely get rid of him, and the little guy will die without me. I wanted to take him in myself, but it didn't work out. I live in a small room, no place for him. I gave my apartment to my daughter and son-in-law. Edward thought for a moment, then said, You know, I don't mind. Show me where he is. If everything is okay, I'll take him home after work. I'll figure something out with my landlady. Mark approvingly patted the intern on the shoulder. That's the spirit, Edward. Trust me, the pup will grow up to be a fine dog. I've had many dogs in my life, and I can tell this one will be loyal, brave, and won't be scared of a wolf or even a bear. You've really intrigued me, Mark. Let's go see him. Unfortunately, Edward didn't get the chance to follow through with his plan, as he immediately heard the angry shout of the department head. Edward, where are you wandering off to again? Go to Leslie Dean's room and check on her, then report to me. I'm interested in your opinion to understand how you think and what kind of doctor you'll become. Edward flinched and glanced around nervously. Okay, William, I'm going. Mark shook his head and quietly added, You'd better go, Edward, or you'll get in trouble. You can pick up the puppy after your shift. I'll put him in a box with holes to make it easier for you to take him. Thank you, I appreciate it. Edward nodded and hurried back to the department. Entering the room, Edward immediately noticed that Leslie was awake, watching him through half-closed eyes. Thank you for your help, the patient whispered. Edward started and looked at her. It's nothing, it's my job. I didn't even know the equipment was faulty, I just had a strange feeling and decided to check. It's not surprising, the equipment is old, and these things happen. Nothing serious, but it's better if the machinery works properly for everyone's peace of mind. Leslie thought for a moment, then asked, Edward, that's your name, right? Could you go to the maternity ward and check on my babies? I miss them so much. If you can, take a picture of them with your phone and show me. Or maybe a short video. Just a couple of minutes, please. I just want to see them, even for a moment. Can you? Edward looked at the patient with doubt. Of course, he was ready to fulfill her request immediately. But how could he do it with the department head watching his every move? This filled the young intern with genuine and sincere concern. On the other hand, he couldn't refuse her. All right, I'll go. But a bit later, okay? When the head of the department closes his office and gets busy with paperwork. Leslie nodded in agreement and gave Edward a warm look. The young intern checked on her health, monitored her vital signs, and then briefly noted everything in his work notebook. He had been keeping notes for some time now, to make necessary remarks and remember what was most important. Everyone knows that in university, we only receive theoretical knowledge, while practical experience is only gained in real-time work conditions. Unfortunately, Edward was unaware of the main reason for William's resentment towards him, which was not accidental and mainly involved his parents, with whom William had once studied. More than 25 years ago, Edward's adoptive father, Robert, had taken William's fiancée, who later became Robert's wife. William, now a future resuscitologist, had not forgotten this grievance and patiently waited for an opportunity to take out his dissatisfaction on someone from the Vetrov family. That opportunity had finally presented itself. William knew that Edward was not Robert's biological son, but he relished any chance to get at Edward and give him a real dressing down as a doctor. Deep down, William understood that Edward was indeed the best intern he had ever had to train, but he could not admit this to his subordinate. Firstly, he did not want to embarrass himself by acknowledging that Edward had immediately noticed the equipment malfunction in Leslie's room, unlike him. Secondly, William feared that doing so would undermine his authority, which had remained unassailable in the eyes of many interns for years. Waiting for the right moment, Edward decided to fulfill Leslie's request and sneaked into the ward where her triplets were kept. However, as he left the intensive care unit, he did not notice that he was being closely watched by the head nurse, Teresa Lee, who immediately reported the incident to William. Few people knew that part of Teresa's duties involved informally monitoring the staff to maintain order. Essentially, she was William's informant, giving the boss the ability to be involved in all important issues: who said what, who thought what, and how they felt about the management. Rumor had it that Teresa and William were even quite close, in a way that should not be made public, as both were married and had children. Seeing the handsome young intern at the maternity ward door, the duty nurse asked, "Well, what do you need here? Aren't you doing your internship in intensive care?" Edward smiled shyly and then said, "A patient asked me to check on her babies, Leslie Dean." "Do you know her?" Karen smiled. "Of course, I know her. Triplets, you know, it's hard to forget something like that. In all my time here, it's never happened, so it's quite a sensation for our ward. They say it's even going to be in the local newspaper and on TV." Edward shrugged in confusion. "What's the big deal? Triplets are just triplets." Karen pursed her plump lips indignantly. "You don't know the most important part. She got pregnant through artificial insemination. That is, with material taken from a special genetic data bank. Have you heard of that?" "I've heard of it, but I haven't dealt with it personally and haven't really thought about it," Edward replied. The nurse smiled. "Well, you should think about it. It's a good thing, especially when the husband can't have children." Edward didn't comment on Karen's remark, but instead asked where the room he needed was. Understanding that the conversation was over, Karen gave him detailed directions on where to go and how to get there. As he walked away, she added, "Edward, wait, listen, the father is visiting the kids, so you better wait by the door and enter later." But Edward didn't hear Karen's last words as he was hurrying to fulfill Leslie's request and return unnoticed to his ward. If William realized he was missing again, there would be no avoiding a scandal. Edward also knew that it was unwise to argue with the head of the department. After all, William would be responsible for his future placement, and Edward dreamed of working at the city's first hospital. He was confident he could handle any challenges, but he had no desire to be sent to a provincial area. Approaching the door, Edward was about to enter when he heard a heated conversation. One of the voices belonged to Alfred, and the other was presumably the head of the obstetrics department. Alfred spoke loudly and forcefully, characteristic of wealthy people. "Listen to me, Michael. My wife, Leslie, is in intensive care, still in a coma, and we don't know if she'll come out of it. This whole pregnancy thing was doomed from the start. I was always against it." The head of the department gasped in surprise. "What do you mean, you were against it? Didn't you know your wife was planning to get pregnant using bank genetic material?" Realizing he had said too much, Alfred bit his tongue. "Of course I knew. I just didn't like it, that's all. The doctors warned us that Leslie's health wasn't great, her blood clotting is poor, but she decided to go through with it. And then triplets, a C-section, anesthesia, you understand the risks involved." Michael Bennett looked at Alfred intently. "So what are you proposing? Abandon the children? Leave them in a nursery? Why start this in the first place?" Alfred smiled ingenuously. "Circumstances were different then, but now everything has changed. If my wife doesn't come out of the coma, I'll be practically a widower, you see? Why would I want that burden? Besides, I genuinely don't know what to do with the infants. Let them stay in the nursery for now, and if or when Leslie recovers, we'll take them back." Edward almost pounded the wall in frustration, muttering under his breath, "My God, how is this possible? These are babies. So what if they're not biologically his? He's still fully responsible for them." Fortunately, the head of the department wasn't willing to give up so easily either. "No, young man, I don't think you'll find an ally in me. We do help people who are in dire financial straits or something similar, marginalized people or those without a permanent home. But you're a wealthy man. Why are you doing this? Surely you have the money to support triplets." Sensing resistance, Alfred persisted. "You might be overestimating my capabilities, Michael. If you've forgotten, all the assets are in my wife's name, and she's in a coma now. So I want to place the children in the nursery. I'm sure they'll be better off there, with professionals. And I promise to support your department and the nursery too. If you want, I'll arrange for the necessary funds to be transferred to your account right now. I'm not abandoning them entirely. It will be like hiring a specialized nanny, but instead of one nanny, there will be several, and the children will be in a special facility under reliable supervision. Meanwhile, I can focus on my business and caring for my sick wife without obstacles." The head of the department pondered for a moment. Meanwhile, Edward, boiling with anger, couldn't contain himself and burst into the room. "Excuse me," he began, "but I accidentally overheard part of your conversation. Believe me, you don't know the whole truth. The fact is, Leslie has already regained consciousness, and it looks like she's going to be fine. So now only she, as the mother, can decide whether to give the children up to the orphanage or not." Alfred snorted indignantly, "And who are you? A doctor or an orderly, a scarecrow? Who gave you the right to barge in here?" Edward struggled to control his emotions, then smiled. "Me? I'm an intern who wants to help people, and I'm sure Leslie will make the right decision, unlike you." Michael waved his hands in protest. "All right, stop it. This is a ward for newborns, not a place for squabbles. Take your disputes outside. I won't be filing any papers, and I advise you not to either. If you persist, I'll have to call the police to determine whether you can care for the children or not." Alfred glared at Edward with hatred, then stormed out of the room, slamming the door loudly. The head of the department looked at the young intern with a friendly expression, as he knew his parents well and held no grudge. "Did you need something, Edward?" The young man hesitated for a moment, then explained Leslie's request, stammering over every word. By the end, the head of the department was smiling broadly. "Well, as I said, any normal mother would never give up her children. Whether she's poor or rich doesn't matter. And you, Edward, go ahead and take pictures, even videos if you like. I'm not against it. The fact that she came out of the coma is a good sign. Fate itself is telling us to keep the children with their mother. She'll get better, and we'll bring the babies to her ward, as she still can't get up." Edward sighed with relief and got to work. The head of the department, after a brief pause, tactfully left the room to let the young man fulfill the mother's request. Seeing the trio of rosy-cheeked babies, Edward smiled and realized he might have chosen the wrong field of medicine. Perhaps he should have become an obstetrician. He hadn't realized how much he loved babies and everything related to them. After taking a few pictures and a short video, Edward hurried back. It seemed everything had gone smoothly, but as he was passing through the corridor near the intensive care unit, William intercepted him with a triumphant look. "Where have you been wandering off to again, Edward? I see you really want to end up on an internship in the provinces. Be careful, or I'll make sure your life gets interesting. If you fail this practicum, I'll personally ensure you get placed as an intern in the morgue. There, you won't cause any trouble, that's the last stop. It's not the nicest place, smells like disinfectant all the time, cold, constant sniffles and bronchitis. It's a resort, really. But I want to become a resuscitation doctor, William. I've told you that." The head of the department smiled. "Ah? So what? All right, first of all, I'm giving you a reprimand for not being at your place during working hours. Now, hurry up and go to the department, walk through the wards, and see what's going on there. Note all the changes in the patient's conditions constantly, or you'll never learn anything." Edward nodded obediently and trudged off. The mood noticeably worsened. The conversation with William was to blame for everything, but Leslie really liked the pictures of the babies. Tears welled up in her eyes as she smiled at the young intern, ready to worship him for his service. "Oh, no need to thank me, I just did it out of the kindness of my heart. You asked, and I delivered. Although your husband came into the ward, he seemed strange, wanted to send the children to a nursery, but the head of the department opposed it, stood up for the babies." "Michael is a good man," Edward said. Leslie looked at Edward with fear. "How could Alfred want to send the children to a nursery?" "I asked you not to do anything without me," she said. Edward nodded in agreement. "Yes, I know, you said so. He just decided to act on his own, apparently. He doesn't know yet that you've come out of your coma." Leslie thanked Edward again for his help, then sank into painful reflection. She had never doubted that Alfred betrayed her, and essentially, she was to blame for it. Being a wealthy businesswoman, she had taken under her wing a snake in the form of her future husband from the local cooperative, which once worked under her leadership. Before meeting Leslie, Alfred was nothing special. He led an ordinary life, like a rolling stone. He never stayed anywhere for long, constantly changed jobs, and always needed money. Leslie, on the other hand, rose from scratch. She accidentally started fishing when at the dawn of her business career, she learned that she could buy shares of the local fish processing plant at a bargain price. She even had to take out a loan from the bank to buy the enterprise, which eventually paid off handsomely, several times over. Under her leadership, fishing in the region flourished again and began to bring in a consistently high income. Furthermore, along the entire coast, tourist zones with a couple of good hotels and a network of snack bars appeared. But the most amazing thing was that Leslie never considered herself too rich to flaunt her status. Like before, she drove a modest car, had no security or servants in her own home. But Alfred, settling in a luxurious residence, immediately insisted on a major overhaul and hiring servants and security. Leslie always took care of everything in the house herself, cleaning, cooking delicious dinners, and even fighting the leaves in her own yard and adjacent area. Alfred, however, wanted luxury and wealth, which he had never seen in his life. Given the opportunity to access his wife's financial assets, he became obsessed with it once and for all. Leslie wasn't sure who Samantha was, the person her husband was talking to on the phone. Although she suspected that she was probably one of the assistants working at one of the coastal hotels. A year ago, when Leslie found out that Alfred couldn't have children, she didn't divorce him and offered an alternative solution, getting pregnant artificially. Alfred took this proposal badly, and Leslie frowned. "How can you talk about children like that? It will be my child, do you understand? The one I carry from conception to birth." Alfred just scoffed skeptically, but Leslie paid no attention to it. She didn't even realize that she had already made a very big mistake in her life by agreeing to this marriage. Because back then, Alfred was completely different, talking about how he loved children and dreamed of having both a boy and a girl in their family. Now, however, consumed by wealth and luxury, he only thought about his own enrichment and nothing else. Leslie considered this extravagance, knowing the value of money and how hard it was to earn it. Those who knew her personally understood what a lonely woman had to go through before achieving financial independence. Unfortunately, only now did Leslie face the consequences of her rash choice. Alfred betrayed his wife and planned to forge her will, thinking she would never wake up from her coma. "No, Alfred, you've miscalculated here. We'll fight, my children and I will fight, mark my words," thought Leslie, gritting her teeth. At that very moment, in a fit of anger, the husband rushed out of the hospital building and headed towards his car, where Samantha patiently waited for him. Ironically, Leslie was not mistaken and accurately guessed her professional affiliation. Samantha indeed worked as a chambermaid in one of the hotels, so she envied her employer with bitter hatred. Seeing her excited lover, she immediately asked, "So, is there anything to celebrate? Did it all work out?" Alfred shook his head negatively. "No, it's much worse." She woke up. "I didn't go to her again the second time. I had enough of what I saw. She's barely breathing, all pale. I thought she had a day, maybe two left. I rushed the notary to make the will properly, so that everything would come to us. And then, you see how everything turned upside down?" "What turned upside down? Did everything collapse?" the dyed blonde exclaimed indignantly. Reluctantly, Alfred continued, "Well, yeah, I wanted to assign the children to the nursery today, but the head of the department went ballistic, made such a scandal, I barely got away with my feet intact." With concern, Samantha looked at her lover. "Well, I told you, you should have gotten rid of these pests right away. You could have refused on the day of delivery, written a disclaimer in the first few hours, and that's it. But who knew that Leslie would come to her senses so quickly? I was getting information from the head nurse. She said that with her body's peculiarities, she could stay in a coma for a year, and in a year, we would have had crumbs left from her inheritance." After chatting a little more, the couple indulged in a passionate kiss, unaware that at that very moment, Mark Johnson was carefully watching them. Shaking his head disapprovingly, the janitor took the broom in his hands and headed to the opposite side of the yard. Today's shift dragged on for Edward as if it were made of rubber. His mood remained dismal, tainted by the incident in the maternity ward and the subsequent reprimand from William. Essentially, Edward understood that he hadn't done anything wrong, but on the other hand, his actions warranted criticism from the boss, who would now decide whether Edward deserved to work in this department or not. Additionally, the young intern feared the judgment of his parents. Although they weren't his biological parents, he had long considered them the closest people in the world. What if his father said that his adopted son proved unworthy of the trust placed in him? His mother wouldn't criticize him, of course, but she would surely shed a tear and sigh sadly, and Edward's heart would ache with pity. After waiting for the end of his shift, he changed clothes and quickly left the intensive care unit. At that moment, a familiar male voice called out to him, "Hey, where are you off to?" Edward turned around and shook his head ruefully. "Oh, sorry, Mark, I got a bit distracted." "Of course, I'll take the foundling, let me bring it here." Taking the box from the janitor's hands, the guy looked inside and smiled happily. There indeed sat a little puppy, amusingly sniffing from side to side and noisily inhaling the air. "You know, be sure to pamper him with milk for the first time, okay? And don't give him anything solid yet. If you want to buy something, there are special puppy canned foods in the store. They're a bit pricier, but I think he won't eat too much anyway. And if you don't know something, it's better to ask, all right?" Mark asked with a smile. "Of course, I'll do everything, don't worry. If anything, I know how to treat people, so I'll definitely manage with the puppy," Edward replied eagerly. Mark breathed a sigh of relief and added as Edward walked away, "Well, God willing, God willing. All right, son, see you later." Taking the box in his hands, Edward quickly headed towards the nearest bus stop. Passers-by looked at the tall young man carrying a strange burden. However, Edward didn't mind anymore because he had experienced so many unexpected events that day that he was ready for anything. Fortunately, the landlord agreed to let the guy keep the puppy in the rented house, which he promptly named Max. "Well, Max, ready to eat? I'll pour you some milk now, crumble some bread in it, and you'll have lunch, rather dinner," Edward said with a smile. Soon, a small bowl of warm milk and soft bread, giving the substance the necessary thickness, was placed in front of the fluffy pup. Watching Max eagerly enjoy the treat, Edward found himself disliking Leslie's husband, Alfred. He behaved too arrogantly in the hospital and considered himself the master of the situation, though in reality, it was quite the opposite, and he certainly wasn't one. At that very moment, Leslie was contemplating her next move. Firstly, through the duty-orderly Shirley, she asked to bring her phone and hold it to her ear. The girl looked embarrassed, but seeing the pleading gaze in Leslie's eyes, she agreed. "All right, just make sure William doesn't see," she said, then hurried off to the nursing station, where she kept her purse with the smartphone. Returning to Leslie, she dialed the necessary number under her dictation and handed the phone to the patient's ear. As it turned out shortly after, the businesswoman called her family notary, whom she had known for many years. The directive was clear. In the event of her death, all assets should be on a specific bank account, the details of which only a select few would know, and she completely ruled out any possibility of editing or making adjustments. This was done not by chance, but to protect herself from Alfred's subsequent actions. Alan Smith listened with his characteristic calmness and then said, "I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry, Leslie. And your husband's schemes won't lead to anything good, mark my words." Leslie thanked him and ended the call. Then she looked at Shirley with a mysterious glance and asked, "Listen, Shirley, what's that small blue box glowing over there in the corner? Do you see?" The orderly turned around and noticed in the upper right corner of the room a miniature eye directed at the patient's bed. "Oh, that? It's a hidden surveillance camera," Shirley exclaimed in surprise. Recently, all the rooms in the ICU were equipped with these cameras. You know, anything can happen. Patients can come to their senses and fall out of bed. Leslie nodded understandingly and immediately asked the question that worried her. "So, if desired, can you watch videos from them?" Shirley nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I suppose you can. But the recording isn't stored with me, it's with William, the head of the department. It's his responsibility. He always wanted to control the whole process from home, so we're strict about it here in the department. We're busy all day like busy bees because we never know exactly where the camera is placed. And you, I see, have sharp eyes, noticed it right away." Leslie smiled. "I have several of those myself. Well, at the docks, where the fish shipments happen and all that. So, I know a thing or two about cameras," Shirley replied respectfully to the businesswoman. Leslie cautiously continued, "I noticed it right away, just hesitated to ask, and didn't have the strength. But now I absolutely need that recording. In short, Shirley, call William for me, I need to talk to him." Shirley nodded in agreement and hurried to fulfill the request, and within 5 minutes, the head of the department was already in the room. After attentively looking into the patient's eyes, he asked, "Did you need something, Leslie?" In response, she winked meaningfully and slowly recounted the essence of her request to him. William listened silently, but, when he caught the main point, understood that there was definitely sense in the patient's words. "Yes, I think I can help you. Usually, recordings are updated every few days, but it's only been a couple of hours here. I think I can help you. Are you sure you want to do this? Maybe you should make peace with your husband." "Well, who knows what he said?" Leslie shook her head. "No, I definitely need this recording. And then, I want you to pass it on to my notary, Alan Smith. He's aware of everything that's going on and will come for it tomorrow morning. And then he'll handle it himself." The department head smiled but still hesitated to ask the question that troubled him. But Leslie already understood what the tall medical chief was concerned about. "William, you don't need to worry about the future of your department. After I'm discharged, I'll make sure that you receive the latest equipment, and we'll also renovate the facade and update the courtyard. In general, I think I can please you and repay you for bringing me back from the brink." The head blushed to the roots of his hair. "Truly, there are people who see right through you." After hesitating for a moment, William remarked, "Actually, you shouldn't be thanking me, but our intern, Edward. I may push him around, but he's a capable guy. Mark my words, someday he'll definitely take my place." Leslie smiled in agreement and closed her eyes in relief. Now she could rest for a while and gather her thoughts. And the next morning, Alfred and his partner Samantha were in for a very unpleasant surprise in the form of a police raid, which burst into their house and handcuffed them. As it turned out, the recording made by a hidden camera became irrefutable evidence that Alfred intended to pull off a cunning scheme. Essentially, everything was already prepared, but Leslie managed to outsmart him and deliver a preemptive strike. Naturally, at the trial, Samantha distanced herself from everything, pretending that she and Alfred had nothing to do with it. However, she still lost her job at the Coastal Hotel. Alfred, of course, would have to face punishment, though not as severe as one might have wished. Realizing that he had failed, the fraudster tried to beg for forgiveness from Leslie, sending her tearful text messages and passing notes from prison. But the young woman had already made up her mind and made the decision that her loved ones and acquaintances were waiting for from her. Returning from the hospital, she, amidst loud applause from the nurses and midwives, took a trio from the newborn ward, but she didn't leave the clinic alone. She left with Edward, who volunteered to help her. To the surprise of many, the young intern did this of his own volition. Taking one of the babies from the young mother's hands, Edward agreed to pose without further ado for a memorable photo, smiling broadly. Since then, a trusting relationship had been established between him and Leslie, which eventually led them to marriage. However, this happened only after Edward completed his internship and became one of the doctors in the intensive care unit, where he was still warmly welcomed by William Dixon. Now, the adoptive parents could be proud of such a responsible son, who not only proved himself as a real specialist within the clinic's walls, but also found the love of his life, along with 3 grandchildren for the elderly Murphy couple. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.